the silence she left behind. Rain fell in soft sheets over Magnolia Hill Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, the kind of rain that seemed to apologize for itself. Elena Marsh stood at the edge of her mother's open grave in a black coat that was too thin for the chill, watching the casket lower into the earth when her stepbrother Preston Cole leaned close to her ear and whispered, loud enough for the entire family to hear, "You can leave now, Elena. You were never really one of us." Diane Cole, her stepmother of 11 years, did not even turn her head. She simply raised her chin, adjusted her pearl earrings, and said to the small crowd of mourners, "It's a shame, really. Some people show up to funerals just to be seen." Elena felt 60 pairs of eyes shift toward her. Aunts, cousins, neighbors who had known her mother for 30 years. Nobody defended her. Nobody said a word. She looked down at the casket one last time, at the brass plate that read, "Margaret Ann Cole, beloved mother," and she felt something break quietly inside her chest. The way ice breaks under weight, not loud, just final. The wind pulled at the black umbrellas around her, and somewhere behind the family, a bagpiper the Coles had hired played a slow, rehearsed version of Amazing Grace that Margaret would have hated too polished. Nothing like the woman who used to hum off-key while doing dishes. Elena kept her eyes on the wet grass, on the small brass shovel someone handed her out of obligation, and she thought about how strange grief was. How it could sit in the same body as humiliation and somehow make room for both. She turned and walked away from her mother's grave in the rain, past the line of black cars along the cemetery road, past Diane's sister whispering something behind a gloved hand. And nobody in that family had the slightest idea what they had just done, because in exactly 6 days, every single one of them would learn that the woman they had just humiliated owned the very ground they were standing on. 3 years earlier, Elena had been a certified public accountant with a modest office on King Street, quietly building a second career nobody in her family bothered to ask about. Her mother, Margaret, had remarried when Elena was 26, to a widower named Richard Cole, a man who owned a chain of boutique inns along the South Carolina coast. Richard had a son from his first marriage, Preston, 3 years older than Elena. Loud where she was quiet, entitled where she was careful. For over a decade, Elena had watched Preston treated like the heir apparent to everything Richard and later Margaret built together. He drove the newer car. He got the corner office at Cole Coastal Properties. He got introduced at parties as the future of the company. Elena got introduced, when she was introduced at all, as Margaret's daughter, the accountant. There had been warning signs, small ones, the kind Elena only recognized in hindsight. The Christmas, Diane rearranged the seating chart so Elena sat at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, while Preston's college roommate got a seat of honor. The year Richard's will was updated, and nobody thought to call Elena, though she found out about the meeting from a cousin who assumed she already knew. The quiet way Preston introduced her at his own wedding. "And this is Elena, Margaret's daughter." As though the sentence needed nothing else. As though 31 years of being her mother's only child could be folded into 6 words and set aside. Margaret had noticed all of it, every slight, filing each one away long before Elena ever spoke of them out loud. What none of them knew, what Elena had never told a soul outside of one very careful, very discreet attorney, was that 4 years ago, her mother had come to her, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon with rain very much like today's, and said words that changed everything. "Elena," Margaret had said, sitting across from her at a small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to never speak of it until I'm gone." "Mom, you're scaring me." "I'm not dying, not yet. But I'm not foolish either. I've watched Richard's health decline, and when he goes, Diane will run this family like a queen with no king to answer to. And Preston will let her. I built half of what this family has, Elena. My money went into those inns before I ever married Richard. Money I made, money my first husband, your father, left me. And I will not watch Diane hand it all to a boy who has never worked an honest day for any of it." Margaret had reached into a worn leather folder and slid a stack of documents across the table. I'm placing the Whitmore Trust, the original inn, the land it sits on, and 40% ownership in Cole Coastal Properties into a private holding company. Harbor Light Holdings. You are going to be its sole trustee and majority owner. Not Richard. Not Diane. Not Preston. You. Elena had stared at the papers, hands trembling. Mom, they'll never accept this. They'll say I manipulated you. Which is exactly why no one will know until it matters, Margaret said. You will not run the day-to-day business. You'll let Preston have his title, his office, his ego. You'll simply own the ground he's standing on. And when the time comes, and you'll know when it comes, you'll decide what kind of family deserves what you're holding. And if I say no? Elena had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then I'll find another way, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering why I never trusted you with the truth, Margaret said. I'd rather you carry this and resent me a little than watch you carry nothing and lose everything. Elena had signed the documents that night in her mother's kitchen, the rain tapping against the window above the sink, her hands cold, her heart heavier than she expected. Margaret made her practice saying nothing, actually practice it, like a line in a play, because she knew her daughter's face gave away too much when she was hiding something important. You have to be able to sit across from Preston at Thanksgiving, Margaret had said, almost smiling, and pass him the mashed potatoes like you don't own the house he's eating them in. There was a particular Sunday, the spring before Margaret died, that Elena would replay often in the months after the funeral. The whole family had gathered at Richard and Diane's house on the Isle of Palms, Preston at the head of the table now that his father was gone, carving a roast like a man auditioning for a role he already believed he'd won. He'd spent 20 minutes describing a new marina development he wanted to pursue, gesturing with his fork, while Diane nodded along and Margaret sat quietly beside Elena, saying almost nothing. You're awfully quiet tonight, Elena, Preston had said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. No opinions on real estate? I thought accountants loved talking numbers. I think you should run your projections past someone before you commit that much capital, Elena had said carefully. That parcel floods twice a year. FEMA remapped the zone 18 months ago. Preston had laughed, waving his fork. I'll leave the big decisions to the people actually running the company, Elena. No offense. Margaret had said nothing at the table that night. But in the car afterward, gripping the wheel a little too tightly, she'd said, You were right. And he'll never once consider that you might be. It was the closest Margaret ever came, before the will reading, to admitting how far the imbalance had gone. For 3 years, Elena did exactly that. She quietly managed Harbor Light Holdings through her own small firm on King Street, operating under a name almost nobody in the family recognized, attending closed-door meetings with the company's real bank and its real attorneys on Tuesday afternoons, she told her family were client calls. She sat through birthday dinners and holiday brunches while Preston bragged about deals he believed were entirely his own. And she smiled, and she passed the mashed potatoes, and she said nothing at all. Margaret had died of a sudden stroke on a Thursday morning in March, 6 days before that rain-soaked funeral, before she ever got to say the words out loud to the family herself. And so it fell to Elena to say nothing at all until the family said something unforgivable first. The morning after the funeral, Elena drove not home, but to a modest brick office 3 blocks from the water where a woman named Corinne Alvarez ran a small forensic accounting practice. Corinne had been Margaret's friend since nursing school decades ago, long before either of them had married anyone named Cole, and she was the only person besides Walter Ashby who had known about Harbor Light Holdings from the beginning. They humiliated you at the grave, Corinne said, pouring 2 cups of coffee neither of them would drink. I heard from your cousin Renee. I'm sorry, Elena. I need to know something, Elena said. Before I go into that reading and say nothing, I need to know if there's anything in that company Preston could hide from me. Any debt. Any asset moved somewhere, I can't see it. Corinne turned her monitor around. Weeks earlier, quietly and at Elena's request, She had pulled every filing Cole Coastal Properties had made with the state in the last 18 months. Buried in a routine amendment was a line that made Elena's stomach drop: a listing agreement, signed by Diane as acting principal, to sell the original Whitmore Inn parcel to a coastal developer named Bristol Group for $11 million, a fraction of what the land alone would be worth once the new marina project 2 miles south was finished. She doesn't have the authority to sell that land, Elena said quietly. She never did. Even before the trust, that parcel required Richard's signature. He's been dead 2 years. Which means, Corinne said, either she forged something, or she's counting on nobody checking until the ink is dry. Elena sat back, and for the first time since her mother's death, something other than grief moved through her, something colder, steadier, closer to resolve. Her mother had told her, all those years ago at the kitchen table, that she would know when the moment came. Watching that listing agreement glow on Corinne's screen, Elena understood with total clarity that the moment had arrived. "Pull everything," Elena said. "Every signature, every date, every wire transfer tied to that listing. I want it ready before the estate reading." "You think they'll try to push it through fast?" Corinne said. "I think Diana spent 2 years assuming nobody was watching," Elena said. "She's about to learn how wrong she was." The reading of Richard Cole's original estate documents happened 4 days after the funeral, in the wood-paneled office of Coastal Trust and Estate Law on Broad Street. Richard himself had passed 2 years earlier, and this was, technically, the reading of the remaining combined estate. A formality everyone assumed was simple. Diane arrived in a cream suit, Preston beside her in a blazer that cost more than Elena's monthly rent. Elena sat near the back, having been invited almost as an afterthought by the family's longtime attorney, Walter Ashby, a soft-spoken man in his 70s who had known Margaret since before Elena was born. Preston did not bother lowering his voice. "I don't know why she's even here. Mom's will is clear. The inns go to me. Dad wanted it that way, and Margaret never had the standing to change any of it." "Preston," Diane said with a thin smile, "let's simply let Walter do his job." Walter cleared his throat, opened a folder, and read through the original 2019 Will Richards Inns, the family home, and the operating business of Cole Coastal Properties, all left in trust for Preston, exactly as everyone expected. Preston sat back, arms crossed, satisfaction settling over his face like sunlight. "There," he said. "Simple. Now, if Elena would like to collect any of Margaret's personal jewelry, we're happy to arrange." "There is one more matter," Walter said quietly. He slid a second folder across the table, thicker, newer, the seal on it barely 3 years old. 4 years ago, your mother, Margaret Cole, established a separate holding entity known as Harbor Light Holdings, LLC. Into this entity, she placed the deed to the original Whitmore Inn property, the flagship location, and the land beneath it, along with a 40% ownership stake in Cole Coastal Properties itself, purchased using her own premarital funds under a properly executed buy-in agreement with Richard in 2015. The room went very still. "The sole trustee and majority shareholder of Harbor Light Holdings," Walter continued, adjusting his glasses, "is Elena Marsh." Diane's teacup rattled against its saucer. Preston laughed a short, disbelieving bark. "That's not possible. That has to be a mistake. My father owned that land outright." "Your father owned the buildings constructed on it," Walter said. "The land itself, and 40% of the operating company that runs your inns, has belonged to Harbor Light Holdings since 2020. Which means, effective immediately, any lease renewal, any refinancing, any sale of Cole Coastal Properties requires Ms. Marsh's signature as majority landowner and significant equity holder." Preston's face had gone the color of old paper. "This is insane. She tricked my stepmother, my father's wife, into signing this. This is elder manipulation. We'll contest it in court." "You're welcome to try," Walter said calmly. "Though I'd remind you I personally witnessed and notarized the signing, alongside 2 independent attorneys and a forensic accountant who confirmed Margaret's full mental competency at the time. There's also video documentation of the signing, taken at Margaret's own insistence, specifically to prevent exactly this accusation. Elena reached into her bag and set a single folder on the table, sliding it toward Diane rather than Preston. "While we're discussing paperwork," Elena said, "perhaps you'd like to explain this." Diane opened the folder. Her face went pale as she scanned the listing agreement, her own signature, the $11 million figure, the Bristol Group letterhead. "That's a private business matter," Diane said quickly. "It has nothing to do with today." "It has everything to do with today," Elena said. "You listed a parcel of land for sale that you have never had legal authority to sell, not before my mother's trust, and certainly not after it. Richard's signature has been required on any transfer of that property since 2015, and Richard has been gone 2 years, which means either you forged a dead man's signature or you were planning to sell my land out from under a company you don't control, to a developer who would have flattened it before anyone in this room noticed." The room, already still, went silent in a different way now, the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they understood. "You've had this the whole time," Diane whispered. "I've had it for 3 weeks," Elena said. "I was hoping I wouldn't need it." Diane's composure cracked for the first time in years. "Elena, say something." Elena finally looked up from her hands. "I told Mom this would happen. I told her you'd assume the worst of me the moment you found out. I was right. You let us bury my father, bury your own mother, humiliate you at the grave, and you said nothing?" Diane's voice rose, brittle with fury. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because Mom asked me not to," Elena said quietly. "She wanted to see, without any of this hanging over us, how her family would actually treat me. Not because of what I had, because of who I was." She stood, gathering her coat. "You told me at her grave I was never one of you. You were right about that too. I never wanted to be part of a family that only respects people they think own something." She paused at the door. "As it turns out, I own quite a bit." The weeks that followed were not loud. Elena had learned patience from her mother, and revenge, she believed, was not a single explosive act. It was a series of quiet, correct decisions made by someone who finally held the pen. Preston tried, briefly and expensively, to challenge the trust in court. His attorney withdrew within a month after reviewing the notarized video and the forensic competency evaluation Margaret had insisted on years before her death, a woman who, it turned out, had anticipated every accusation her son might one day make against her daughter. Cole Coastal Properties needed capital that spring to refinance a loan on 2 of its smaller inns, both of which sat on land now owned by Harbor Light Holdings. Preston, as CEO, needed Elena's signature. He called her office 4 times before she finally agreed to a meeting, not out of cruelty, but because she wanted, one final time, to look him in the eye and understand whether anything in him had actually changed. It hadn't. "You know you owe this family something," Preston said, sliding the refinancing papers across her desk. "You've had this power for months and done nothing but sit on it. Some of us actually run this company." "I've done exactly what my mother asked," Elena said. "I let you run it. I never once interfered with day-to-day operations, Preston. I could have. I chose not to. So sign it." Elena studied the document for a long moment, then set it down. "I will, but not for free and not without terms. Cole Coastal Properties will restructure its board to include 1 seat held by Harbor Light Holdings permanently. Any future sale of company assets requires majority board approval, not just yours. And Diane's consulting contract, the one paying her $110,000 a year for work, your own bookkeeper can't identify, ends this quarter." Preston's jaw tightened. "You'd blackmail your own family." "I'm not blackmailing anyone," Elena said. "I'm simply no longer allowing this family to treat my ownership as an inconvenience while treating my absence as a punishment. You wanted me gone at the funeral. You can't have it both ways, Preston. You can't want my signature and my silence at the same time." He signed. He had no other choice, and they both knew it. "You've changed," he said quietly, capping his pen, not looking up. "No, Elena said. "I finally stopped shrinking to fit the space you gave me. That's not the same thing." He looked up at that, and for the briefest moment, so brief she almost missed it, something like recognition passed over his face, the look of a man realizing he had spent a decade underestimating the wrong person. He didn't apologize. Elena hadn't expected him to, but he didn't argue either, and for Preston, that was as close to humility as he had ever come. The Bristol Group deal collapsed within the month, once Elena's attorney sent formal notice of the fraudulent listing agreement. Diane resigned her consulting contract before Elena could formally end it, quietly, without a press release, without an apology, moving 2 states away to live near her sister by summer's end. Nobody in the family ever spoke of the funeral out loud again, though everyone remembered it, the way a house remembers a fire long after the walls are repaired. The final twist arrived in June, quiet as a letter in the mail, exactly the way Margaret had always preferred her most important moves to arrive. Walter Ashby called Elena to his office on a Tuesday and handed her one last envelope, a private letter Margaret had written and sealed 18 months before her death, with instructions that it only be opened once the trust had been legally tested and, in Walter's words, once we know how they behaved. Elena opened it alone, in her car, in the parking lot outside Walter's building. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, it means they showed you exactly who they are, and you handled it with more grace than I ever managed with your father's family. I am so sorry I put you through the wait. I needed to know, truly know, whether Richard's family valued you or only valued what I might one day give you. I built Harbor Light for you, not so you could punish anyone. I built it so you would never again have to sit at a table wondering if you belonged there. You already belonged. You simply needed the proof in writing. Do what's right with what I've given you, not what's easy. Preston is not a villain, only a man who was never told no often enough. Diane loved your father in her own limited way. Neither of them ever knew how to make room for you, and that was their failure, not yours. But Elena, don't build a family out of resentment. Build one out of choice. All my love, always." Mom Elena sat in her car for a long time after reading it, the June sun breaking weakly through the clouds, and she cried in a way she had not allowed herself to at the funeral. Not the tight, controlled tears of a woman being watched, but the loud, unguarded kind she had been saving, without realizing it, for a moment when no one else could see her. She called Corinne afterward, sitting in the parking lot with the engine still off. "She knew," Elena said, her voice thick. "She knew I'd handle it the way I did. She wrote that letter before any of it happened." "Your mother," Corinne said gently, "spent 30 years reading people better than anyone I've ever known. She knew exactly who she raised." "She also knew Preston would never really change," Elena said. "She wrote that too. She just didn't want me spending my life waiting for an apology that was never coming." "And are you? Still waiting?" Elena wiped her eyes and looked out at the harbor in the distance. Gray water under a paler gray sky. Gulls circling low over the docks. "No," she said. "I think I stopped the day I signed the board restructuring papers. I just didn't notice until right now." A year later, the Whitmore Inn reopened under its new ownership structure on a clear October evening, string lights strung along the veranda, the smell of salt air mixing with fresh paint and cut flowers. Its lobby was quietly renamed the Margaret Room in honor of the woman who had built its foundation twice, once with money, and once with patience. A small brass plaque near the entrance read simply, "For Margaret, who built quietly." Preston attended the reopening. He stood near the bar for most of the evening, watching guests move through a space his father had built and his stepmother had nearly lost, and at some point, without an audience, he found Elena near the veranda railing. "It's a good building," he said, which for Preston was practically an apology. "She would have liked what you did with the lobby." "She would have liked that you showed up," Elena said. He nodded, turning his glass slowly in his hand. "I don't think I ever really saw you, Elena. Not the way she did." "No," Elena agreed. "You didn't, but you're here now. That counts for something." It was as close as they would ever come to peace, and Elena decided, watching him walk back toward the bar, that it was close enough. Elena did not take Cole Coastal Properties away from Preston. She did something in the end that surprised everyone, including herself. She kept her board seat. She used it exactly twice a year, always fairly, always without cruelty, precisely as her mother had asked. Preston kept his title, his office, his ambition, but never again mistook Elena's silence for weakness, because he had learned, the hard way, that some people don't raise their voice when they win. They simply sign the paperwork. Diane never apologized. Elena stopped waiting for one. What she did instead was quietly buy a small, run-down inn 2 towns over with her own money. No trust, no inheritance, entirely her own, and she named it, simply Margaret's, painted in soft gold letters above the door. She ran it herself on weekends, met guests personally, remembered their names, and built slowly and deliberately the kind of place her mother had always believed she was capable of building. On the first anniversary of her mother's death, Elena drove back to Magnolia Hill Cemetery alone, without a bagpiper, without a black umbrella, just a bouquet of the yellow tea roses Margaret used to grow along the back fence. She sat on the wet grass in jeans instead of mourning black, and she told her mother everything about Corinne, about the listing agreement, about Preston's quiet nod that was as close to an apology as he would ever manage, about the small inn she'd bought 2 towns over with money that was entirely, finally, her own. "I did it the way you asked," Elena said to the headstone, her voice steady in the empty cemetery air. "I didn't build it out of resentment." She stood, brushed the grass from her knees, and drove to Margaret's, her Margaret's, the small inn with the gold letters above the door where a guest was waiting at the front desk with a question about breakfast hours, and Elena answered it herself, the way she always did, remembering the guest's name from the reservation without having to check. She never spoke of the funeral again. She didn't need to. She had already answered it not with anger, but with everything she quietly, patiently, and rightfully owned. Moral lesson. Real power rarely announces itself, and real family isn't measured by who stands closest to you at a funeral. It's measured by who never made you doubt you belonged. The strongest response to being underestimated is not a scene, it's proof, held quietly until the moment truth speaks for itself.